I'll never forget the moment my phone buzzed on my mahogany desk in the dead hours of a rain-soaked night. A moment that shattered the delicate balance of my meticulously ordered life. It was a call far removed from the usual pings of business updates and client messages. Instead, the screen illuminated with an image that froze my heart. My wife, Eleanor, caught mid-laugh with an expression of abandon and vulnerability I hadn't seen in years. But what made the sight unbearable was the unmistakable presence of my son, Luke, standing uncomfortably close with his arm draped casually over her shoulder. His eyes, dark and defiant, seemed to challenge me, daring me to confront the betrayal captured in that single, damning photograph. For over 20 years, Eleanor and I had built our life on routine and precision. Our grand home was a testament to our shared achievements, a place where every detail, from the gleam of the polished hardwood floors to the soft murmur of conversation over dinner, spoke of a calm and predictable existence. Eleanor moved with a grace that transformed every corridor into a stage of quiet elegance, while I immersed myself in contracts, mergers, and the relentless pursuit of success. In that world, I prided myself on maintaining control, believing that every aspect of our life could be managed through discipline and order. Then came the day Luke returned. He had been away for 3 long years, pursuing a degree that I had funded with every expectation of his eventual gratitude and maturity. He rolled into the driveway in a battered sedan, his disheveled appearance and restless eyes belying the promise of his youth. His arrival stirred old resentments, remnants of the pain left by his mother's untimely death, which had long cast a shadow over our family. At first, I dismissed his demeanor as the natural bitterness of a young man scarred by loss. But as the days passed, subtle signs began to accumulate, a lingering glance between him and Eleanor, a smile that seemed too knowing, a quiet intimacy that grew in the spaces where our family used to stand united. That night, as the rain drummed relentlessly against the windows, I returned to my study with a sense of foreboding. The image on my phone haunted me, and I felt compelled to search for more evidence. I had long installed security cameras throughout the house, a precaution I once considered unnecessary in our safe, predictable world. With trembling fingers, I began reviewing the footage from that fateful night. In the dim glow of the monitor, I saw Eleanor, clad in a soft silk robe, pouring herself a glass of wine with an ease that belied the situation. Beside her, on the worn leather sofa, Luke lounged with a casual confidence, his hand resting in a way that was all too intimate on her knee. The camera captured every forbidden gesture, every stolen glance. As I watched the images replay, my mind raced with a mixture of disbelief and mounting anger. Each frame was a confirmation, a silent testament to a betrayal that had been growing slowly, insidiously over time. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in our home transformed. Mornings, which had once been filled with quiet routine, now carried a tension that was palpable. Eleanor's graceful movements became hesitant. Her eyes, once warm and inviting, now flickered with guilt and an unspoken sorrow. At breakfast, I deliberately left my phone face up on the table, watching closely as Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly when reaching for her coffee cup. Luke, always the silent observer, avoided my gaze, his expression dark and unreadable. In those small, telling moments, I began to piece together a painful truth. My family was no longer the sanctuary I believed it to be. Every accidental touch, every half-spoken word exchanged between Eleanor and Luke, now resonated in my ears like the toll of a distant bell announcing an inevitable reckoning. I started to record these moments in my mind, and later, by carefully reviewing the security footage, I built a dossier of undeniable evidence. I had thought myself too busy, too ensnared in the pursuit of success, to notice the cracks in our familial affaire. But the truth was stark. Beneath the surface of our orderly life, betrayal had taken root. That night, as the rain subsided to a constant, drumming murmur and the rest of the world slept unaware, I sat alone in my study. The only light came from the flickering screen of my computer, displaying the silent footage of Eleanor and Luke, a tableau of intimacy and deception that cut deeper than any spoken word could. I replayed the sequences over and over, each time feeling the weight of every secret, every suppressed emotion. It was as though the camera had captured not just their physical proximity, but the very essence of their betrayal, a betrayal that would irrevocably alter the course of our lives. In the quiet solitude of that darkened room, I found myself reflecting on the early days of our marriage, a time when love had been effortless, when every shared smile and gentle touch had been a promise of a future built on mutual trust. But the years had worn us down. The routine of daily life, the endless focus on business, had gradually eroded the spontaneous passion that once defined our relationship. It was in this slow, creeping decay that the seeds of betrayal had found fertile ground. I wondered how I had failed to see the signs. Had I been so blinded by my own pursuit of control and success that I missed the subtle shifts in our home? The lingering glances, the whispered words in the kitchen after I had retired for the night, and the warmth of a touch that should have belonged only to me, all these had been clues that I had chosen to ignore. Now, the evidence was irrefutable. The home that I had built as a fortress of order had become a stage for the unraveling of everything I held dear. As I sat there, the images from the night's footage burning into my memory, I made a silent vow. I would no longer allow betrayal to fester in the shadows. I would gather every piece of evidence, every moment of deceit, and use it to reclaim the control that was slipping away. My heart was heavy with sorrow and anger, but beneath that, a cold determination began to crystallize. I had built my life on the certainty of control and order, and now I would do whatever it took to restore that order, even if it meant facing the painful truth about the ones I loved most. In that rain-drenched, solitary hour, as the storm outside gave way to a haunting stillness, I realized that the calm of our home was nothing more than a brittle veneer. The photograph that had shattered my world was just the beginning, a stark reminder that the foundation of trust can be as fragile as glass. And once broken, there is no returning to the life that once was. In the days that followed the damning revelation, our home transformed into a silent battleground of unspoken tension and fractured trust. Mornings that once promised routine now carried an undercurrent of dread. As I rose early to prepare for another day of relentless meetings and business calls, I could sense the weight of what had been revealed. Every creak in the hallway, every whispered murmur from behind closed doors, reminded me that the life I had painstakingly built was slipping away. Eleanor's transformation was subtle yet unmistakable. The woman who once exuded grace now moved through our home with a hesitancy that betrayed an inner turmoil. I observed her at breakfast, sitting at the long oak table with an air of resignation. Her fingers trembled as she lifted a cup of coffee, her eyes darting away when they met mine. The radiant warmth that had once lit her face had been replaced by a pallid, almost haunted expression. It was as though she were perpetually battling a secret too heavy to bear, a secret that slowly eroded her spirit. Luke, too, seemed to change with each passing day. The young man who had returned with a brooding anger now wore his defiance like armor. At first, I had hoped his return might signal a chance at reconciliation, a bridging of the distance that had grown between us. Instead, his silence became a statement. He avoided eye contact during family meals and responded to my questions with curt, clipped answers. I began to note every furtive glance exchanged between him and Eleanor, a shared smile here, a gentle touch there, that seemed to speak of complicity in the betrayal. Each small gesture was a shard of broken trust, slowly piecing together a painful mosaic of deceit. As the weeks trudged on, the tension in our home became palpable. I spent countless evenings alone in my study, not out of loneliness, but driven by an obsessive need to document every detail. The upgraded security cameras streamed live footage into my computer, and I scrutinized every frame, every subtle shift in expression. In one sequence, I caught Eleanor pausing by the kitchen window, her eyes lingering on the rain-soaked garden, as if searching for solace. In another, I saw Luke lean close to her, his hand briefly grazing hers, a gesture that lasted just long enough to set my pulse racing. These moments, small and easily dismissed by an outsider, were now the pieces of an undeniable puzzle. Late one night, as the rain turned to a steady drizzle, I found myself rewatching a particular clip, a sequence where Eleanor, in a moment of rare vulnerability, lowered her gaze and her expression softened into something resembling regret. It was the only instance that hinted at remorse, yet it stung all the more because it confirmed the complexity of her betrayal. Had our love, once so vibrant and unyielding, diminished into mere habit? And was Luke's defiance a cry for help, or simply a reflection of his own inner rot? These questions haunted me, even as I felt a burgeoning resolve to reclaim the control I had lost. The slow unraveling of our family was a painful process, one punctuated by minor conflicts and near-silent confrontations. One afternoon, as I passed by the living room, I overheard a low conversation. Eleanor's soft, almost pleading tone mingled with Luke's terse, dismissive replies. Their words were too fragmented to grasp fully, yet the tension was unmistakable. I paused at the doorway, hidden in the shadows, and listened as they spoke in hushed tones about the past and what needs to be done. The conversation ended abruptly, leaving behind only an echo of despair and a lingering sense of inevitability. It was clear that they were aware, in their own way, that something had to change. I began to confront my own inner demons in these long, sleepless nights. The images from the camera replayed in my mind relentlessly, a vivid montage of every secret moment. I questioned whether I had been complicit in the slow decay of our marriage. Had I been so consumed with maintaining an image of control that I failed to nurture the fragile bonds of love? The thought was a bitter pill to swallow. The certainty that I had once clung to, that I was the master of my domain, now felt like a cruel illusion. In my quest for order and success, had I inadvertently left the door open for betrayal to creep in? Despite the mounting evidence, I wrestled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. I found myself pacing the polished floors of our home late at night, the sound of my footsteps echoing in an empty hall. In those moments, the silence was as deafening as any scream, and every shadow seemed to whisper the truth I could no longer deny. I became methodical in my approach, cataloging each instance of intimacy between Eleanor and Luke, noting the time stamps and the expressions that revealed far more than their casual words ever could. Every detail was a reminder of the life that was disintegrating around me, a life where trust had been shattered, leaving only fragments of what once was. There were days when I attempted to speak with Eleanor, my tone calm and measured, yet every conversation ended with a heavy silence. I tried to ask about the little things, a misplaced cup, a delayed reply, but her evasive answers only deepened the chasm between us. The confrontation that I knew was coming seemed to hover in the air, inevitable and terrifying. I realized that if I were to restore order, I would eventually have to force the truth into the open, regardless of the pain it would inflict on all of us. In the midst of this emotional maelstrom, I also felt an unsettling clarity. The betrayal had stripped away the veneer of perfection that had long masked the underlying vulnerabilities in our relationship. Now, with every secret recorded and every lie exposed, I faced the raw reality of our situation. It was a harsh awakening, a moment when the facade of a well-ordered life gave way to a turbulent storm of emotions and unanswered questions. I was forced to confront not only the actions of those I loved but also the failings within myself. As the days passed, I began to see a pattern emerging in the interactions between Eleanor and Luke. Their exchanges, once fleeting and innocuous, now appeared charged with a dangerous intimacy. I noticed the way Eleanor's eyes would linger on Luke's face a fraction too long, or how his hand would brush against hers with a hesitation that spoke of longing and regret. These moments were the silent signatures of a betrayal that had been allowed to fester beneath the surface, hidden behind a veneer of routine and professionalism. Every evening, as darkness settled over our home and the security cameras continued their unblinking vigil, I steeled myself for what was to come. I knew that the time for silent observation was drawing to an end. The mounting evidence, coupled with the unmistakable tension in every room, left me with a single, inescapable conclusion. Our family was on the brink of irrevocable change. And if I were to regain the control I so desperately craved, I would have to confront that change head-on, no matter how painful or destructive the truth might be. In the quiet, oppressive hours of one particularly long night, as I reviewed the latest footage, I realized that every moment of betrayal was leading inexorably toward a final reckoning. The patterns were clear, the evidence irrefutable. I felt both the sting of loss and the cold certainty of retribution. In that moment, with the rain tapping a steady rhythm against the window pane and the images of Eleanor and Luke etched into my mind, I resolved to take action. The Ade was crumbling, and it was time to face the harsh reality of our fractured lives. The mounting tension in our home finally reached a breaking point. For weeks, the slow unraveling of our once stable family had built to an almost unbearable crescendo, and now, on a stormy evening heavy with the promise of change, everything came to a head. It began subtly at first. I made a calculated decision to speak of future plans, a casual mention of a weekend retreat to our lake house, as if it were a normal business trip. I observed their reactions closely. Eleanor's eyes, once so serene, darkened with a mixture of apprehension and something I could only describe as guilt. Luke's jaw clenched, and for the first time in many days, I saw anger flicker across his face, a raw, unfiltered emotion that told me he no longer wished to remain silent. That evening, after dinner had passed in an oppressive silence punctuated only by the distant murmur of rain, I gathered them in the living room. The room, usually a haven of order and comfortable routine, now felt charged with an almost palpable hostility. The soft light from the table lamp cast long shadows on the walls, emphasizing the lines of tension etched into every face. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the confrontation that was inevitable. "Eleanor," I began, my voice measured and calm, "I believe we need to talk." Her eyes darted away for a moment before meeting mine again, an unspoken question lingering there, mixed with sorrow and resignation. Luke shifted in his seat, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the room, as if searching for an escape. I continued, "For a long time, I have trusted that our home was built on truth and commitment. But lately, I have observed actions and heard whispers that suggest otherwise." My words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. I paused, letting silence underscore every syllable. "I've seen things," I added, "and I've recorded them. Every moment of intimacy, every silent conversation between you two, it speaks of betrayal." A collective shudder passed through the room. Eleanor's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the sofa, and Luke's eyes, dark with anger, finally met mine. "What are you talking about?" he snapped, his voice brittle with defiance. But his tone held a trace of uncertainty, as if he had long expected this confrontation. Eleanor's voice, barely above a whisper, emerged next. "It's not as simple as you say," her words faltered, laden with a mixture of regret and fear. For a long moment, the only sound was the steady rhythm of the rain outside, punctuating the silence that now reigned. I pressed on, "Do not pretend I am blind. I have seen every furtive glance, every touch that should have been mine alone. I trusted you, both of you, to maintain what we built here, our family, our home." My voice was cold, unyielding, and as I spoke, I saw the walls of denial begin to crumble. Luke's expression contorted into anger. "So now you're the judge?" he retorted sharply. "You think you have the right to decide what's true? You think you're entitled to control every aspect of our lives?" His words were laced with bitterness and a long-simmering resentment, echoing years of pent-up frustration. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she tried to speak. I never meant to hurt you. It wasn't planned. It just happened." Her protest was soft, desperate, a plea for understanding that fell on ears already hardened by betrayal. The room grew charged with conflict. I recalled every recorded moment, the quiet intimacy, the secretive gestures, and the evidence now stood as a stark indictment against both of them. "It happened," I said slowly, "and I have all the proof I need. This isn't just about a fleeting moment of weakness, it's about a pattern, a deliberate erosion of the trust that held this family together." The tension escalated into raised voices. Luke slammed his fist onto the coffee table. "You have no right," he shouted, voice trembling with anger and hurt. "You built a fortress of silence around yourself, never asking why you were never home, why you never really listened, and now you're accusing us without understanding our pain?" I met his glare steadily. "I listened," I replied, "but sometimes silence hides more than words ever could. I have seen everything, and I can no longer allow this charade to continue." Every word was deliberate, each syllable a calculated blow meant to strip away the pretenses that had long shielded our deception. In that charged moment, the confrontation teetered on the edge of physicality. Eleanor, with tears streaming down her cheeks, reached out a trembling hand as if to bridge the gulf between us. "Please," she pleaded softly, "let us talk this out without more pain." But the tension was too raw, every emotion was on high alert, and the promise of a peaceful discussion dissolved into the storm that raged within our hearts. Luke's face hardened, and in a desperate move born of both fear and defiance, he abruptly stood up. His eyes flashed with a dangerous light, and in his hand, I caught sight of something glinting, a small handgun that he had hidden away, a final, terrifying symbol of his rebellion. The room fell silent for an instant as reality sank in. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears, as I realized that our confrontation had escalated to a point from which there might be no return. "Luke, put that down," I said calmly, even as my mind raced with dread. My tone was firm, intended to diffuse the situation rather than incite further violence. But the air was charged with so much raw emotion that nothing seemed to quell the impending eruption. His hand trembled, the weapon raised in a gesture that was as much an act of defiance as it was a cry for help. "I'm tired of pretending," he growled, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm tired of being the forgotten one, of watching you dictate every moment of our lives." His words, raw and unfiltered, cut through the tension like a knife. At that critical juncture, the silence was shattered by the sound of a gunshot, a sudden, deafening report that echoed through the room, reverberating off the walls and into our very souls. In that split second, time seemed to slow. I felt a sharp, searing pain in my shoulder, and for a moment, I could barely comprehend the horror unfolding before me. Luke's eyes widened in shock, and Eleanor's anguished cry filled the space. The chaos that followed was a blur of frantic movement and desperate shouts. I lunged forward instinctively, trying to wrest control of the situation away from the man I once called my son. In the ensuing struggle, the weapon skittered across the floor, clattering to a halt. For a long, agonizing moment, we stood there, Luke, with anger and regret contorting his features, and me, fighting against the pain and betrayal that surged through my veins. The room was thick with an overwhelming mixture of fury, sorrow, and a profound sense of loss. Eleanor sank to her knees, her face contorted in despair, while I struggled to steady my breathing despite the pain radiating from my shoulder. The evidence of our fractured lives lay bare in that moment. The shattered trust, the violent rupture of what was once a secure family bond. In the heavy silence that followed, I knew that nothing could ever restore what had been lost. The confrontation had not only laid bare the truth but had irrevocably altered the fabric of our existence. As I gazed at Luke, I saw not just the defiant anger of a son rebelling against authority, but the deep, unspoken sorrow of a young man burdened by his own demons. And in Eleanor's tear-streaked face, I saw the anguish of a woman caught in the crossfire of love and betrayal, her eyes pleading for forgiveness even as the damage was done. With a heavy heart, I realized that our family was now defined by a new, brutal reality, one where secrets were no longer hidden in the shadows, and where every act of betrayal had a price. The confrontation was only the beginning of a long, painful journey toward a reckoning that none of us could escape. In that moment, I vowed that I would reclaim control of my life, no matter the cost, even if it meant shattering every remaining illusion of love and trust. As the storm outside began to subside, leaving only a haunting echo of rain on the windows, the living room remained steeped in silence, a silence that spoke volumes of the shattered past and the uncertain future that lay ahead. The confrontation had been violent, raw, and unyielding, and though the immediate chaos had subsided, I knew that the scars it left would endure, marking us all forever. In the long, harrowing hours after that fateful confrontation, the silence in our home was not peaceful but laden with an oppressive weight, a heavy reminder of all that had been lost. The storm had finally abated outside, leaving the world drenched in a fragile, uncertain calm, but inside, nothing was as it once had been. The echoes of that explosive moment still reverberated off the walls, mixing with the steady drip of water from the eaves and the quiet hum of an unsettled night. I sat alone in the living room, my injured shoulder a constant, burning reminder of the violent rupture in our family's bonds, while the shattered fragments of our lives lay scattered like broken glass. Luke remained in a daze, slumped against the cold wall, his eyes vacant for a moment before the storm of anger and regret returned. Eleanor, trembling and tear-streaked, sank to the floor as if the weight of the truth had physically crushed her. The confrontation had left us exposed, our vulnerabilities, our betrayals, our unspoken sorrows, laid bare for all to see. In that moment, the certainty of our former life dissolved into a painful reality. We had all crossed a line from which there was no return. Over the following days, the atmosphere in our home became a quiet, painful limbo. I spent hours reviewing the footage from that night, the images burning themselves into my mind. Every stolen glance, every desperate plea from Eleanor, every defiant snarl from Luke, each moment was now an indelible mark, a scar on the fabric of our family. The recordings, which had once been nothing more than silent witnesses to our daily lives, had become irrefutable evidence of our downfall. I knew that this evidence would not only haunt us but also serve as the cornerstone of the new order I was determined to impose. In the days that followed, I found myself oscillating between deep sorrow and a cold, unyielding resolve. I took stock of the ruins of our shattered relationships, and with each passing hour, I began to understand that reclaiming control meant more than just punishing betrayal. It meant rebuilding a life based on truth, however brutal that truth might be. I could no longer afford the luxury of illusions. I had to face the stark reality that the family I once cherished was now irrevocably fractured. But in that painful clarity, I also discovered an inner strength that I had long forgotten. One morning, as pale light seeped through the curtains and the world outside stirred with tentative hope, I confronted Eleanor. She sat at the kitchen table, her eyes red from crying, her hands clasped around a cold cup of coffee. The silence between us was thick, heavy with what had transpired. I spoke slowly, deliberately. Eleanor, I have seen everything. I have recorded every moment of betrayal. We cannot ignore the past any longer. Her eyes, downcast and haunted, searched mine for some sign of forgiveness or understanding, but I could offer neither. Instead, I continued, our lives have been irreversibly altered. I cannot unsee what has been done, and neither can you. There was no anger in my voice, only a solemn resignation that underscored the finality of our situation. For Luke, the situation was even more complex. He had withdrawn into himself after the confrontation, spending long hours isolated in his room, his once defiant expression now replaced by a deep-seated despair. One afternoon, I found him seated on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the wall. I sat beside him without a word, allowing the silence to fill the space between us. Finally, he spoke in a low, broken voice. I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. The apology, fragile and unconvincing, only deepened the chasm between us. I realized then that the pain of betrayal was a burden we each had to bear alone, and that forgiveness, if it were ever to come, would be a long and uncertain journey. I began to formalize my new approach. Over the next several weeks, I set up meetings with trusted legal advisors and counselors, determined to secure both the tangible and intangible remnants of control. The evidence I had collected became the basis of a silent, personal trial, a reckoning that would redefine the parameters of our future. I was not interested in immediate retribution. Rather, I sought to establish a new order, one where the truth was paramount and no act of betrayal could remain unpunished. This resolve, forged in the crucible of pain and isolation, was not about revenge alone, but about reclaiming the integrity of a life built on order and certainty. In the midst of this internal reorganization, I began to notice subtle shifts in Eleanor's demeanor. The frantic, disoriented grief slowly gave way to a resigned sorrow, as if she too was beginning to understand the irreversible nature of our situation. She started attending counseling sessions, and while our conversations remained guarded and measured, there was a tentative willingness on her part to face the consequences of our past. Luke, however, remained distant, a tortured soul burdened by his own mistakes. His occasional attempts at conversation were met with curt, hollow replies, and it was clear that he was wrestling with the overwhelming guilt of his actions. As I methodically rebuilt the structure of my life, I also set about redefining the boundaries of our shattered family. I drafted new legal agreements concerning our assets, our responsibilities, and the roles we would each play in a future that was uncertain and fraught with pain. The process was as much about reclaiming control as it was about establishing a framework for healing. A framework that, though it could never restore what was lost, might at least allow us to move forward with some semblance of dignity. I spent many nights alone in my study, the soft glow of my computer screen illuminating a room filled with silence and shadows. In those quiet moments, I reflected on the nature of betrayal and the cost of maintaining control. I realized that the pursuit of perfection, of an unblemished image, had blinded me to the underlying vulnerabilities that had festered in our home. It was a lesson learned at a high price, a price that would echo in the corridors of my mind for years to come. And so, as the weeks turned into months, our family began to navigate the turbulent waters of a new reality. The once seamless veneer of our domestic life was now replaced by a mosaic of broken trust and hard-won truths. I was no longer the unchallenged master of my domain. I had been forced to confront the limits of control and the inevitability of human frailty. In that harsh new light, I discovered that reclaiming power did not come solely through domination or punishment, but through the acceptance of painful truths and the willingness to rebuild from the ashes. By the time autumn arrived, with its chill winds and fading light, a tentative order had emerged from the chaos. Eleanor and I rarely spoke of the past in explicit terms, yet there was a mutual understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the irreversible rupture. Luke remained estranged, his future uncertain, a living reminder of the consequences of our collective failure. And I, with my shoulders still aching from the night's violent upheaval, carried the weight of my decisions with a grim determination. This new order, hard-won and unyielding, was not a return to the past but a step into an uncertain future. I had reclaimed control over my life, but the cost was etched in every scar, every broken memory, and every silent glance exchanged in our now fractured home. The evidence of our downfall would forever be a part of me, a constant reminder that in a world built on fragile trust, the price of betrayal is steep and the path to redemption is paved with sorrow and irrevocable change. And so, as I continue to navigate the aftermath of that life-altering night, I do so with the bitter certainty that nothing can ever be the same. The legacy of our shattered family is now a part of who I am, a dark chapter in a story that continues to unfold, one where every secret, every betrayal, and every act of retribution shapes the uncertain contours of our future. And I had just stepped into a game that was much, much bigger than I ever realized. And that's the end of today's story. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories like this one. Got thoughts or experiences you'd like to share? Drop them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.